Welcome back to ERM Advantage. I'm Eric Holmquist. So we are finally, mercifully, wrapping up our series on operational risk assessments as a component of the overall enterprise risk assessment. Previously, we talked about all of the steps to develop the assessment and gather the information. In this video, we're going to wrap up a few loose ends on the overall assessment framework, and then we're going to be talking about aggregating information and then developing the reports, graphs, etc. So let's get into it. So before we move on to aggregating all this information together and developing our summary reports, etc., I want to circle back on the assessment matrix we covered in the last video and just point out a couple of other elements to consider. These are optional elements and depending on the situation may or may not be relevant, but they're at least good to be aware of just in case. The first is a couple of columns that are focused on loss data and loss estimations. Now, the majority of institutions don't routinely track loss information, at least not at any detailed level, but for larger institutions this is fairly common. So for these, there is a series of hidden columns that can be used if desired. The first is simply for tracking losses realized year to date, and again, this is associated with this particular process. Now, the second is designed for capturing what the business considers to be loss potential. Again, building on the information captured in the narrative document, if this event were to occur, what could be a top-end value of potential loss? And finally, a field which calculates an estimated residual loss potential. And really all this is doing is just taking the loss potential number and just reducing it proportionally based on the risk treatment strength identified. Changing the risk treatment strength will adjust the residual potential. And none of this information factors into any of the risk calculations. It's merely here as a reference if somebody wanted to capture losses associated with a given process or the potential for losses. Now, as I've said in a previous video, I'm really not a huge fan of loss information, particularly in the context of operational risk, simply because if we're doing our jobs correctly, any loss should lead to remediation efforts which reduces or eliminates the possibility of a similar event happening. Again, it's the only risk category where we actively try to make the data meaningless. Even gathering this information can be problematic. First off, losses realized may not even be assigned to a business unit, let alone to an individual process. Sometimes they're just tracked into a central GL. Second, the impact of a given event can go way beyond just a hard dollar impact and sometimes significantly more. You also have to consider soft dollar consequences, business disruptions, as well as impacts to customers, regulatory relations, and even reputation. So looking at the data this way can be an imperfect exercise on a good day. Where the information can be useful, if only to identify where losses historically tend to take place and which processes tend to be associated with the highest potential losses. That can certainly support some decision making around products, market segments, or simply as a heat map of where there may be operational problems. But this information should be seen as almost anecdotal and should never be the basis of forward forecasts. Simply put, operational loss data is literally the worst possible kind of tea leaves. Past events rarely correlate to future possibilities. The net result, gathering this information can become a significant amount of work to essentially tell you what you already know, which is why I'm not a fan. Another provision is an optional element that I have occasionally included and that I've seen cleverly introduced into several GRC solutions, and that is the ability to specify two risk mitigation scores, which then results in two residual risk values. One value reflects the current state of mitigation, and the second that reflects a potential state, assuming a desired target mitigation level. Now, in most cases, these should be approximately close to each other, so the difference really isn't very meaningful. But in cases where mitigants are either significantly underdeveloped or are determined to be materially deficient, it can be helpful to see where the risk level could be with the appropriate mitigants in place. A good example would be when evaluating a new product, initiative, business line, etc., where the relevant risk mitigants simply don't exist yet, in order to show the gap between mitigants in place today versus what would be needed to mitigate the incremental risk to acceptable levels. This could also support discussion around potential limitations in the ability to mitigate certain risks. We'd ideally like them to be strong, but the best we really could hope to do would be a sort of a satisfactory. The bottom line is, in cases where residual risk is considered unacceptably high, it can be helpful for people to see what a future state could potentially look like with further development. And as stated earlier, this template does have a number of other sub-tabs that I've used on occasion, including one associated with assessing individual controls and one that breaks down compliance risks into more detail, either by regulatory theme or all the way down to individual regulations. In the latter case, while out of scope for this discussion, and generally for the operational risk assessment, this would allow compliance to build on the data and then build out their compliance risk assessment if they so chose to. Now, we don't have time to go through all these additional tabs, but I simply wanted to point out that these are very logical next level elements building on the information that we already have here. At minimum, this should help you through thinking about how you might structure a GRC solution so you have the ability to go down to these next levels. There is, however, one tab that I do want to walk through because it's proven extremely valuable in the discovery process with business units. And that's this tab labeled Assessment Questions. Now, as we've evaluated each risk individually and asked the business unit to come to a conclusion about what they think the risk treatment strengths are, even though we are in theory basing that rating on the treatments described in detail part of the exercise, I still find that certain biases tend to slip into the evaluation. The purpose of these general questions is to ask about the overall environment, not just focusing on a specific risk. Now, this section is broken down into 3 groups of questions: general control environment, policies, procedures, which is one of the most important parts of mitigants we have, and management oversight. And these questions could all be changed. This is just what I have used and found effective. For each of these questions, the business unit is asked to characterize their confidence level based, again, on a 5-point scale labeled always, usually, occasionally, rarely, or never. So, for instance, is segregation of duties clearly defined within your area? Are audit findings minimal for your area, etc.? Once all the questions have then been answered, the answers get graphed and an overall score is calculated. And these scores can be graphed across all business units to see where some units may see weaknesses, where others may rate themselves well above the mean. Now, this accomplishes several things. First, it really helps bring to light areas of potential weakness, which becomes particularly meaningful if the same weaknesses are observed in a pattern across business units, which I often see. Second, if the answers display a pattern of consistently high or consistently low scores, that often gives some insights into how the business perceived or is at least representing their control environment. This may very well be a source of challenge, particularly if all the scores are unusually high. Finally, and in the assessment model itself, the overall scores from these questions may influence slightly the residual risk scores in the assessment matrix. This works where higher scores here may add slightly to risk mitigation rating, and lower scores may reduce slightly risk mitigation scores. I found this to be a very effective way to flatten some of the biases that people often bring to this analysis. If they rated all of their risk treatment scores as very high, but then indicate here that procedures are often outdated or lacking or not always followed, then this will tend to flatten some of those biases. Again, there's no right or wrong in any assessment structure, but I have just found that this structure to be very effective in tightening up the analysis while providing a safe way of vocalizing areas for possible improvement. In addition, there are a couple of other tabs here that we're not going to spend time on, and I did mention them briefly in the last video, But the spirit of them is worth pointing out, as these may be elements that you want to consider within your framework. The idea behind these other tabs is taking information from the overall operational assessment and going one level deeper. This is obviously beyond the scope of the basic assessment, but it may make sense if you're looking to leverage this information in multiple ways. The first is a set of tabs focused on individual controls or other key risk treatments. Now, as we discussed in the last video, when we think about the strength of our various risk treatments, it doesn't make sense to rate each individual one. That would exponentially increase the amount of time it takes just to complete this analysis, and simply isn't necessary to get a baseline assessment. But over time, you may want the business to spend some more time documenting and rating specific controls, which may give some insight into where things like control testing done by the business may be warranted. For these two tabs, one is designed to build a list of standardized controls that are available in drop-down lists in the other tab. Now, this can be useful if you're planning to move the information to, say, a GRC or other automated solution at some point, giving you a running start on normalized data now while you're building the data versus once you've stood up a solution. Now, honestly, having a standardized set of controls is frankly more of a nice to have than a must have. And there are actually times when I'm really not a fan, but certainly can be beneficial to a larger organization where control registers can start to get out of hand. Then in the primary tab is where the user can take a given risk and list out specific controls and other mitigants, document them in terms of types of mitigants, whether say a SOX control or a key control, etc., as well as whether each is considered preventative, detective, or recovery. And then rate those individuals both in terms of design and effectiveness. Here I also include a separate section for internal audit where they can add their own set of ratings and other notes if desired. Again, this supports the idea of using this information on common sets of data in multiple ways. Then the last sets of tabs we'll talk about follows the same principle, but is for breaking down compliance risks into more detail. Again, when we talk about compliance risks in the context of an operational assessment, we don't necessarily want to get into too much detail because that's likely already covered within the compliance risk assessment. So for the overall operational risk assessment, we would typically only go as far as to say that one of the key risks, where applicable, is failing to comply with applicable laws and regulations. The compliance risk assessment should pick it up from there and break that down into failing to comply with what. But if your compliance risk assessment doesn't have that detail, or if the compliance team would simply like to leverage this template, then these tabs are how we would do that. Two of these tabs are where you would build your list of regulatory themes and then the individual laws or regulations contained within those, again, as applicable to your organization. Then in this main tab is where you would take the high-level risk of failure to comply and start to break it down into more granular risks, either by themes such as fair banking or truth in lending, or down to an individual law or reg level. Either is fine, it really depends on how you want to do it. And since failing to comply is a risk, we'd want to consider the same factors of inherent likelihood, impact, and risk treatment strength. Now, as with the overall operational risks, you could certainly also use the risk detail document to provide narrative support for these ratings, or you could just include that in a separate document, up to you. Again, we're not going to spend more time on these subcomponents. I simply show these as examples where you could build on the risk assessment information to go deeper wherever you see fit. Next, we move to pull all of this information together and building some meaningful reports. So obviously we start by taking the individual departmental worksheets, and once each department feels comfortable that they're where they want them, they're accurate, then we begin aggregating those into an overall aggregation sheet. You basically just do this by going in each of the worksheets, in this case just copying them, and then pasting them into the master sheet, values only, so we're not bringing formulas. And from there, that gives us our overall master aggregation sheet, from which we can begin sorting the information and preparing our various charts and graphs. Now, one of the questions that tends to come up when you're using spreadsheets is, can this be semi-automated where the aggregation sheet has links to all the other sheets? The answer is yes, but honestly, it's more trouble than it's worth. Maintaining referential integrity becomes a huge problem, and frankly, it's just as fast just to recopy in the information anytime there's a major update to the analysis. Now, one point that does come up anytime we aggregate information together is the fact that anytime you average information, some of the nuance of the information gets lost. So anytime we're combining ratings together to average them out, we have to be sort of careful. For instance, supposing that we've got a set of risks where one is considered high, and using a simple 1 to 10 scale, that would be a 9. And then I've got several more risks. One is a very low to low, a 2, another 2, and then one to very low, which is a 1. So we average these out and we end up with a score of about 3.5. Well, let's say I have a second set of risks, and in the second set, risk 1 is a low mod, risk 2 is, risk 3 is low, risk 4 is low. And so again, our average is 3.5. So by averaging these out, we end up with the same score, but you'll notice that in list A, there's an outlier, which is the high one. And in the average, that gets lost. Now, the average can still be useful because it gives us an overall sort of a barometer of the overall risk within a given area. But this is why it becomes so important that when we're presenting information in the aggregate, we can include average ratings, that's fine, but it always has to be accompanied with the list of key risks as well, so that those individual higher risks don't get lost in the averaging. So regardless of what method you use when aggregating risk records, a couple things to keep in mind. The fact that lower end risks, those with residual risk levels of low or very low, can obviously have a drag or watering down effect on averages. Now, it may still make sense to have those risks in there if they're inherently high and worth noting for that effect. But you may also want to reconsider whether they really are key risks. The average ratings mainly serve to focus on relative rankings. A process with an average risk score of 50 is clearly riskier than one with a 22. Nevertheless, when preparing our reports, this is why it's critical that the analysis includes both aggregated averages as well as listings of individual key risks. This way, if a business unit has one uniquely high risk and a handful of low or very low, the one high risk might get lost in the average, but it will stand out in the risk register. Both ways of looking at the data can be informative, but in different ways. We do need to be careful not to get caught up in overestimating the precision of this exercise. Again, assessments are best effort analysis. But as long as we're looking at the information through different lenses, we should be able to see the most meaningful elements. So now that we have our complete risk register, we can cut up and present this information in a number of meaningful ways. First, I'm going to talk about how we might visualize the information, and then we'll talk about pulling it all together into our final report. Okay, so we think about visualizing this information. Certainly we want to start with our lists, and inherent risk is the place to start, and what are our top inherent risks. Now, for each of these groups of risks, we obviously can show this either in a table form or show it in graphical form. And at different times, different versions are useful. In this case, I don't know if the graph is all that informative. The table really just works best. And again, there's likely not going to be any surprises when talking about top inherent risk. We sort of know that, but this still can be useful if only for awareness and discussion. And even though residual risk is most closely tied to risk appetite, that doesn't mean that some consideration shouldn't be given as to whether these risks are acceptable. I mean, somebody might look at this and say, why are you even in that business? Obviously, this could also be filtered in a variety of ways by business unit, by risk type, etc. But again, this just gives us a starting place saying what are the key inherent risks we're talking about. Then, more meaningfully, is talking about top residual risks. In this case, what we're really looking for is outliers. Again, we can present this either in a table form or a list, as well as graphically. And again, I don't know that graphically necessarily tells us that much. It could be informative. Again, it's just a good visual. But in the end, you're really focusing on individual risks here. This is one of the most important focal points of this exercise. Obviously, any risk then is above a certain threshold, whatever you determine that to be, needs to be discussed. And that may be okay, but it should be discussed. And in those cases where management feels that the risk is outside of acceptable thresholds, then there has to be some management commentary included in the report that talks about their conclusions, maybe some narrative around why they think it's that way, and then what are their associated action plans to get that risk within acceptable levels. And that, again, should be reflected in our overall action plan. The third way we could look at this is the delta, and that's the risks that show the highest level of mitigation. Now, for these, the listing in the table doesn't really do much. I think it's actually easier to see this visually. We can see which risks have that highest level of risk reduction. Now, this can be a meaningful discussion because what we're talking about, again, is that level of reduction. And there may be some value in just gut checking. Are we sure about that? Are we comfortable that we've actually mitigated that much risk? And again, I think that's why sometimes the visual is helpful. But when we're talking about these, it's a good idea just to have some conversation around, do we feel comfortable with that? There's always a chance that risk treatments could be, a little overstated in order to avoid visibility around that risk. But talking about it, and again, just questioning the assumptions associated with those treatments really supports an environment of transparency and accountability, saying, look, this may be fine, but look, we're warranting that this has a lot of reduction in these risks. Let's just make sure that we're being realistic. Okay, then we can start to think about how we visualize kind of the aggregate information. And certainly one of the most popular is the old heat maps. I am a fan of these because I think they do help visualize information and can help us identify things. In this case, this is a classic sort of a heat map of individual risks shown as a bubble chart where the bubble's size indicates the number of risks at that quadrant. And again, what we're looking for is the outliers as well as some general concentrations. You could also do the same thing with the risk types. Again, we've got the data. You could do the same thing by business units. There's a number of ways that you could do this. So the nice thing about heat maps is, again, they really help us visualize both for outliers as well as for general patterns. When I look at sort of the concentration of my risks, that should sort of align with my overall risk appetite philosophy. If our risk appetite is low and yet everything is sort of grouped around the middle in the yellow there, well, we're not in line with where we should be. So again, it's another data point that can be informative. This obviously becomes useful if we're comparing the information to our stated risk appetite levels. The other sort of requisite matrix is the risk type matrix, where we've got our rows representing the different risk types and showing the sort of aggregate inherent risk treatment, residual risk, then the related risk appetite for each of those, and certainly risk trend. And again, because we aggregated, we want to go back to the earlier conversation about aggregating. We want to make sure we don't lose the individuals in this, but it is useful to see what the overall looks like. Again, this can be good where we're talking especially where there may be areas where we think the current is not lined up with our appetite, and we say, why? Why is that the case? Are we taking too much risk, too little risk? As well as maybe have some conversation around trends where there's increasing levels, etc. So again, this can aid discussion, just general discussion, particularly as a general kind of check against risk appetite and where there may be areas of increasing risk. But really all it's good for is just a high-level conversation. From here, the more meaningful information obviously is in the details. Now, quick note, we've only been talking up until now around the operational risks. That certainly would inform part of this. But in order for this to be accurate, we will need to have the information from the macro side of the enterprise risk assessment, which we're going to get to next. And finally, recall earlier we talked about the tab within the sheet where we ask these general questions. And this is something, again, regardless of what templates or platform you use, I find this to be very helpful, because what we do is we're stepping back from individual risks and asking questions about the overall environment and elements that might influence risk, things like policies, procedures, segregation of duty, approvals, things like that. And when we did this, the answers from each business unit we summarized and we assigned a score to. And again, while this is not a perfect reflection of a control environment, it's a good reflection of the overall environment. There's a couple things we can do with this information. Number one, we can graph it based on the answers. In this case, what this is showing is the colors represent the different answers people gave to the questions, all the way from never, rarely, occasionally, usually, always. So there may be areas where a lot of people showed a lot of confidence, like down below here. That's good. Let's ask, why are those so good? What are we doing right in those areas that we could do in other areas? Or conversely, where are we seeing challenges within the business where there was a notable concentration of people said, no, we're not confident in that area? Again, this is where we could have some conversation. It gives us a data point around patterns and trends that might be worth further exploration. In addition, because we did have a score for each area, we can also graph those scores. And again, while this is not a complete representation of the control environment, it's a good sort of proxy of each environment. And so when we look at these, there's a couple things we're looking for. Certainly we're looking for outliers. On the low end, we'd want to ask, okay, what's going on there? You felt you had some weakness. What can we do to help strengthen that area? And on the other end, we also look for outliers on the top. And the reality is that very few areas are really that good. And so sometimes, frankly, when we see scores that are really off the chart like that, there may be some instances where they're being a little generous in how they answered these. Again, the whole purpose of this part of the exercise was to be able to identify and to some extent neutralize some biases that may be influencing the assessment. And in this case, either those being low or on the other end being high, that's going to have a slight influence on the overall risk ratings within the risks. So those are good examples of where we want to go in and just have some conversation, check on, make sure we're being realistic, because if we do adjust those, then that will, again, it helps us neutralize some biases in our risk scores. So the nice thing about this is it really does help us identify general areas of strength, at least as it's represented, or weakness, as well as common challenges across business units. And again, this can really help point out certain biases. And not for nothing, but just because we are doing a cross-business unit comparison, again, this is really supporting the idea of a culture of honesty, transparency, be willing to put these side by side and have some honest conversation. Now, there's an almost infinite number of ways that we could represent and render data. And these are just some of the ways that I find to be particularly useful because they each tell a different part of the story. They represent part of the overall mosaic that's our view of risk. And the simple fact is that most people learn visually. And so if we can take the information and, look, long risk registers are boring and we don't know what to do with them. But if we can render information visually, sometimes it helps get to a conversation around understanding where we feel we are and how do we feel about it. Now, for our overall report, there are some key elements that need to be included. First, I find it a good practice to provide senior management with a packet that includes all the business unit overviews. This information is high level enough to not overwhelm, and it helps management gain a better understanding of the various moving parts across the organization and where key risks reside. This also gives a forum for effective challenge by senior management and even by the second and third line, but without getting into the weeds. Then, in terms of the overall report based on the data, this should include an overview of the process, the scope, approach, etc., going back to one of our very early videos. The business unit overviews, as mentioned earlier. your summary charts and graphs we discussed previously, again, whatever you feel is appropriate. And then perhaps most importantly, the conclusions, and there must be conclusions. This is management's perspective on overall risk levels, areas of excess risk levels, areas for process improvements, and critically, the action items identified as a result, either to further reduce risk, improve process, or even better, both. Again, if after all this there is no so what result, then one of several things is true. One, you have the most effectively risk-treated company in the history of companies. This is not a horse I'm going to bet on. Two, the exercise didn't go deep enough, perhaps not asking the right questions or failing to challenge any of the answers. Or three, and perhaps most commonly, the business unit, for whatever reason, did not feel comfortable in being transparent about where there are weaknesses or even simple opportunities for improvement. So, at the risk of putting too fine a point on this, the results simply cannot be a description of the process and summary results. That reduces this whole process to a documentation exercise. This process is always about discovery and improvements, which requires honesty, transparency, and accountability. But the result is a more risk-aware organization and people thinking like risk managers. Now, one thing that I have regrettably seen is management saying, you can't show that process or area as unacceptably high risk. That will look bad to the board or will be criticized by our regulators. The worst version of this is asking people to either not list risks or water down the ratings while they quietly trying to fix the problem behind the scenes. Simply put, this is fraud and it's wrong. In my 30 plus years working in a highly regulated environment, I have never once seen a regulator criticize an institution for simply identifying unacceptably high risk, particularly if it's supported by a related action plan. Never once. What I have seen is cases where an institution deliberately swept something under the rug for fear it will make someone look bad, only to have auditors or regulators come across it. Now you have both the risk to be addressed, along with management that either one, didn't know about it, or two, did and hid it. Quite the opposite. What I have seen is praise from boards and regulators on an institution's ability to identify risks proactively and then implement meaningful solutions to appropriately mitigate the risk. In other words, a weakness becomes a strength. Now, to risk managers listening to this, if you are seeing pressure from management, implicit or explicit, to downplay or turn a blind eye towards unacceptable risk levels, this is a hill worth dying on. You need to stand firm and get CEO or board support that this simply can never happen under any circumstances. Otherwise, all you're doing is putting landmines in the ground, and that's not risk management. And finally, make sure that there's a tracking mechanism for monitoring the progress of action items identified. One of the worst things you could do is produce an action items list but do nothing to ensure that these items are addressed. What that tells people is that this exercise doesn't matter, and in the future, don't bother talking about areas for improvement. Okay, as we wrap up this series, let's just do a quick process recap. We started with preliminary communication to set expectations, to get people thinking globally, to each business unit and to the business unit heads and executives. Optionally, you could deploy some training in advance or training materials to get people acclimated to the process forms, again, if you want. Conducting at least one and up to a series of workshops with each business unit with milestones for each along the way. Some groups catch on faster than others, so adapt. The recommended structure for these workshops, I recommend about 3 hours. I know that's a lot of time, but it just works well. It's long enough to really get engaged, get involved, and really focus on gathering data, but not so long that you've just destroyed everybody. Typically about the first 30 minutes is sort of setup, training, setting expectations, orientation. About an hour and a half in building out the overview, at least in rough terms, and then about an hour assessing a couple of key risks that were identified in that overview discussion, and then the related questions. Then homework for the business is review the overviews, tighten that up, and then rough out the remaining risks in terms of the detail and the matrix. Again, the training could be done at the beginning of each workshop or could be done separately. That's entirely your discretion. And then repeat workshops as necessary. And the second line in risk can be reviewing materials in between, sort of give their input and feedback. But each business unit is different. Again, some will get this immediately and some are just going to take a number of times around the block, and that's fine. Again, we don't want this to be painful. We don't want this to be frustrating. We want to meet each business area where they're at and frankly, help them sort of coach them along so we end up with a meaningful result. Then at the end, there should be one wrap-up workshop. Once the materials are in draft and pretty solid, just sort of gut check all the conclusions. Now, this is a good session to include internal audit in. Again, we've kept them out of the room up until now, but at this point, it's a good time to maybe bring them in, let them have a chance to sort of weigh in, give some perspective, and see if there are any areas where they may have a different opinion, and provide input and challenge. This is also a good time to think about maybe bringing in the more senior, SVP, EVP level, which we had said earlier really wasn't good use of their time in the workshops, but before this all becomes published, they'd want to have a chance to weigh in. But allow them to review the materials in advance so they're not blindsided once they get in the room. If there's something you disagree with, that's fine. Go back, let's talk about it, and come to some conclusions. Next, aggregate all the information together into your aggregate reports. Review that with a management risk committee or other similar body. How much detail is given in there is going to be up to each institution. Facilitate management presentations of each business unit periodically. This is a really good practice of just periodically having a business unit come and themselves speak to the risk in their area, what's going on, what's changing, their key risks, anything like that. It really supports that idea of every area is a risk manager and the fact that they own the risks. Certainly track all the action items through completion. Again, telling internal audit, hands off. The business has to have a reasonable amount of time to address these issues, and if they don't complete things in a reasonable amount of time, then those very well may become action items for audit. And then certainly revisit this analysis periodically if there are any major changes, significant events, anything that may cause you to reevaluate some of your ratings or other conclusions. Remember, the ink never dries on this information. It's not a periodic exercise, it's a living, breathing management tool. Now, a few related notes. We've been focusing on the risks that are associated with a given business unit. But there are such things as enterprise operational risks. In other words, those risks with no single area of responsibility, but are still operational. Some examples are failing to achieve the strategic plan, a major data breach, a failure of a major third party, or other significant external events, a BCP level event, a terrorist event, a pandemic, a natural disaster, etc. Note, these are events. That's different than external influences, which we're going to talk about in our macro session. Now, you could capture these in this module or as part of the macro risks. Either is fine. If done in this module, then what you may want to do is set up a separate set of standalone templates, the overview, a matrix, and a detail sheet. And again, these would just be developed by a collective of some management. But again, they also could be considered as part of the macro conversation, which is where all the other risks that are truly enterprise-wide are going to be covered. Now, if you finish the operational portion of the enterprise risk assessment first, you'll have to note that the results are preliminary. There may be elements from the macro analysis that translate into a business unit and could influence their overall risk profile. There may also be information from the other sub-assessments that need to be factored into the business unit's risks, such as risk associated with a third party, etc. And finally, we're going to be coming back to this framework later on when we're talking about other types of assessments, such as targeted topical assessments, as well as change assessments around new products, services, or other key initiatives. So finally, just some summary points on the overall assessment and process. Constantly reinforce that this is always a discovery process. Leverage as much information as possible. Wherever we can get information to feed into this analysis, use it. Leverage what you can, don't duplicate. Get cross-functional input. Again, there could be a number of subject matter expert areas that you want to weigh in on this business unit's analysis. Don't over-focus on individual controls. Leave that to internal audit. It's fine to identify them, but again, we don't need to go into big detail or document that extensively. The point is just to get a general sense of how risk is mitigated. Residual risk is directly related to business objectives and risk appetite, which is why it's so critical that we get it as accurate as possible and that the business understands it, because it is the risk that they are choosing to accept. Don't boil the ocean. Again, we're really focusing on core processes and key risks. If you end up creating registers that are 100 pages long per business unit, you will lose the business. They understand this needs to be focused on the information that matters. Think about building process maps. And again, I know they are a pain to build and not an immediate priority, but they can be really gold in terms of visually seeing processes both within the department and how it spans into other areas through things like swim lanes. And it's amazing how assumptions can jump out about risks and how risk is managed. Again, there must be a so what. It is the linchpin in all of this. Without that, I'm not saying this is a waste of time, but it was certainly not time effectively used. These should certainly be revisited anytime there's a major change or a major event, and culture and ownership are key. Risk management lives and dies on culture. Now, as we wrap up this section and reflect on the process and, more importantly, the framework approach described throughout these videos, there are some key benefits to consider that really underscore why we use this approach. Number one, as we've said from the beginning, this is entirely structured around the language of the business, while then introducing certain risk terms and concepts. The emphasis has been on core processes and key risk elements. We don't want people focusing on cuts and scrapes. We start with plausible scenarios first, which is intuitive to the business, and then we use the risk types as different lenses for better understanding. But by not trying to shoehorn a risk into a given risk type, we don't frustrate the business, and they're free to consider all types of risk for every kind of event scenario. Certainly, this has given us a much more complete understanding of likelihood and impact of events by virtue of the documentation we built and just the thought process we've used. By separating out risk sources, which can't be rated and only clutter our risk registers, we keep the register focused on key risks. Sources focus on how something can happen, not what could happen. By documenting key assumptions, this can be gold in risk assessments because so often that is where risk truly lies. This certainly gives us better clarity around risk treatments, considering exactly how we mitigate risks and whether they influence things like likelihood or impact. And all of this leads to more accurate risk ratings. Certainly, we've also allowed for an emphasis on potential process improvements. Why not? If we can make it better, great. And most importantly, this all supports an open, transparent risk culture that has accountability for processes and risks and encourages everyone to think like a risk manager. All right, now that we've wrapped up this series, starting in the next video, we're now going to move to the macro side of the enterprise risk assessment, where we consider the areas of strategy, governance, programs, and a variety of external influences, all of which present profound risk to the institution, but can't be analyzed the same way. These are not based on processes and controls, but design assumptions. So once again, please take a second, like this video, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Again, that really helps out the channel. And please feel free to leave a comment if there are any techniques that you use to strengthen your overall operational risk assessment process. Thank you.